Hello, welcome to Stanford Care's In-Language Health webinars. My name is Joshua, and I'm a first-year Stanford Med student. And I'm pleased to bring you this series of in-language talks co-sponsored by Stanford Care, Stanford Health Library, and the Vincent V.C. Wu Memorial Foundation. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Scarlett Gomez, who will speak on addressing emerging breast cancer disparities in Asian American populations, the CRANE study and the ASPIRE Cohort Study. Recently, it's been shown that breast cancer incidence rates have been increasing rapidly among Asian American and Pacific Islander women, with particularly large increases seen among younger women. The CRANE study, led by UCSF, is designed to address this alarming trend, focusing on the role of established risk factors, as well as aiming to identify potential new risk factors. The UCSF team is also launching a new study, the ASPIRE Cohort Study, the first Asian American cohort study for cancer etiology. Dr. Gomez will present the most current data on breast cancer incidence trends for disaggregated AAPI ethnic groups and rationale and information regarding the CRANE and ASPIRE studies. Dr. Scarlett Lin Gomez is a professor and vice chair for faculty development in the Department of Epi and Biostats at UCSF and co-leader of the Cancer Control Program of the Helen Diller Family Comprehensive Cancer Center. She's an epidemiologist with research interests in the role of social determinants of health, including race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, gender, immigration status, sociocultural factors, and neighborhood contextual characteristics on health outcomes. Much of this research is focused specifically on Asian populations. She's also director of the Greater Bay Area Cancer Registry, part of the California Cancer Registry, and the NCI Surveillance, Epidemiology, and Results Program. She's contributed surveillance data regarding cancer incidence and outcome patterns and trends for distinct Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander groups, as well as cancer patterns by nativity status and neighborhood characteristics. In case you've come a bit later, we've recorded this session and we'll share the recording with you all. During the talk, please submit your questions in the Q&A chat below. And at 7:45, we'll have a Q&A with Dr. Gomez with questions both pre-submitted and those that you submitted during the talk. So with no further ado, introducing Dr. Scarlett Gomez.
Thank you so much, Joshua, and I want to thank the CARE group for allowing me to share with you some of the work that we're currently doing. So I'm going to go ahead and start my slides. So this is a work that my group is very passionate about, and so if you'll kind of bear with me, you'll see that some of this really has some personal tones to it. I'm going to be talking about breast cancer, and because, as Joshua mentioned, one of the roles that I am involved in is I am the director of the Greater Bay Area Cancer Registry. We are the designated and lawfully designated entity that collects data on all cases of cancer diagnosed within the Bay Area. There are 3 such registries that we cover, non-overlapping regions, but together are 3 registries in California, cover the entire state of California. So I've been doing this work. I've been involved with the registry for over 25, going on 30 years. And the first thing I noticed when I, joined the cancer registry was, wow, we actually have pretty great data here for us to be able to look at this cancer rates for disaggregated Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander populations. But why aren't we using it? Why are we still reporting data for aggregated populations? And I am first generation Taiwanese American, and I know all Asians are not alike. So that really sort of set the initial motivation for my interests in this area. So a lot of the work we do stems from this cancer registry data and is part of our regular surveillance. And so as we look every year at updated data that come out, we notice certain patterns and trends, and then we propose specific studies to try to better understand what's driving these patterns and trends that we're seeing emerging. So one such emerging pattern and trend that we've been noticing over the past several years is in breast cancer and among Asian American and also broadly among Asian American and Pacific Islander women. So I want to talk to you about some of the latest statistics. These are literally hot off the press. So I would actually ask if you not take screenshots because this is still interim analyses that we're working on and we're still refreshing the data. And then I want to transition to talking about two studies that we're doing, as Joshua mentioned, to try to address some of these emerging disparities that we're noting. Okay, so what do we know? This is what we know about breast cancer among Asian Americans. It is the most commonly diagnosed cancer across all ethnic groups of Asian Americans. Across almost all ethnic groups, it is the second most common cause of cancer-related deaths. Lung cancer is generally the most common cause of cancer-related death. We also know, and we've done this, this is part of my work that stemmed way back from my dissertation, is that breast cancer rates vary quite tremendously, in fact, almost fivefold across all the different Asian American, Native, Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander ethnic groups. And earlier studies show that with regards to migration, risk starts out being fairly low in countries in Asia. And then as you immigrate to the US, you start to take on with the culturation, some of the risk factors that are known to be associated with westernization. Your risk increases. And then subsequently, that risk increases even further with subsequent generations. However, some recent research that we and colleagues at Stanford have done show that this pattern with this immigration pattern where risk starts off low, then goes high, that this may actually be reversing. And then the other thing that we do know is that mammography screening, which is well established as an early detection tool for picking up cancers at an earlier stage, that these rates are generally low across most Asian American groups, and in fact, the lowest among most racial and ethnic groups in the US. This is some of the latest statistics that we started looking at. So I mentioned to you that generally statistics tend to be reported for Asian Americans, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders as one aggregated group. We're 40 different racial and ethnic groups. We speak over 100 different languages. There's tremendous heterogeneity just within the native cultures of these ethnic groups. And not only that, the immigration patterns are different. So when you're looking at those living here in the US, there are very different patterns. Something that we and colleagues who've been looking at International Cancer Registry data have noticed is that breast cancer incidence rates over the past 10 or so years have been increasing the most rapidly among Asian Americans and Asians in Asia. They've been increasing the most rapidly of any population in the US. One paper that came out about 5 years ago did a projection that at the rate of increase, if this keeps up, Asians are going to have the highest rate of breast cancer in the world. So this is very alarming. We went and looked at the latest cancer incidence data that we have. Now, note here that I'm presenting data for this aggregated group, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander. Nonetheless, we were alarmed to see that in the past 5 years of available data, that is from 2016 to 2021, the rate of increase in this population was 2.7% per year. And just for sort of comparative purposes, I've shown here also what the rate of increase for other broad racial and ethnic groups are in the US among non-Hispanic whites, 0.48% per year. This is over a longer period of time. Non-Hispanic Blacks, 0.62% per year, also since 2000. Hispanics have been also going up quite a bit more at 1.3% per year from 2010 to 2021. And the group American Indian, Alaska Native, at 2.8% per year, also since 2020. And just a little asterisks on this is that there are some data issues, particularly coding issues. So I was actually trying to not show the data for the American Indian, Alaska Native, but couldn't figure out how to do that on this graph. So that rate probably is artificially high. So I've been talking about disaggregation. Why am I not showing disaggregated data? This is the hot off the press data. And again, I would ask if you could please, not take a screenshot of this. We have a paper that's ready. Hopefully it will be going out very soon once we get the most updated data set. So this basically shows you, okay, now we've disaggregated. What do we see? I'm going to walk you through this. There's a lot of lines. I've tried to color code this so that it's fairly clear, but I'm going to kind of point out different groups in order. So the first disaggregation we did here was comparing Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders to Asian Americans combined. And what we see is a steady increase at about 1% per year since 2000, so over this 21-year period for the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander group. The rate already is quite high. So as you could see in 2000 in the pink line, their rates of breast cancer is already quite high. The Asian American combined rate, so that's in the black line. The latest 5-year period from 2016 to 2021 shows a 2.9% increase per year. So this is a fairly recent increase, and this is seeing more so among the Asian American population than the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander population. So already there, with just that one disaggregation, we already see differences emerge. Okay, now let's focus on these other Asian groups. So let me move my window out of the way. I'm going to come back to this other Asian not specified group, but let's look at these groups here. Okay, so we had sufficient data to be able to disaggregate for 7 groups. And I've kind of ordered them here, somewhat in order of what the latest time point trends are. So some of the notable patterns, I would say are Asian Indians at 1.2% per year from 2015 to 2021. Japanese trend is fairly stable. Filipinas at 0.6% per year since 2000. Korean had the largest increase, 4.5% per year since 2013. Chinese at 1.3 per year since over the entire time period since 2000. Vietnamese 1.1% also since 2000. And then this probably the second largest increase would be among the Laotian Kampuchean group at 1.9% since 2000. So all groups generally are going up with the slight exception of Japanese, but all Asian American groups are experiencing increasing trends of breast cancer. Okay, let's go back to this other Asian not specified group. What does this mean? This is a group in the cancer registry coding that is kind of a catch-all for when we see in the medical records or whatever data we're pulling cancer registry data from, that they know that this person is Asian, this patient that presented with breast cancer is Asian, but we don't know what specific ethnic group they belong in. Or they might be a specified Asian ethnic group, but not one of the ones that we have a code for in the data set. So this is quite problematic. I think this increase is an artifact of the coding, and this is the updated data that we're waiting for from NCI to be able to update these rates. As you can see, this group has the highest rate. I don't think this is real. I think it's an artifact of the data. And I think many of these people classified into these groups belong to one of these specific groups down here. So I think these rates here are probably underestimated, and this purple line trend here is probably overestimated. But nonetheless, we see an upward trend across all the groups. Among the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander group, we had sufficient numbers to disaggregate into 2 groups, the Native Hawaiian group and the Guamanian Chamorro and other group. And this was interesting. We do see a statistically increasing trend of 1.2% among Native Hawaiians over this entire 21-year period, but actually a more recent declining trend among the Guamanian Chamorro and other group. So just this graph alone tells you that there are differences and that there's value, and it's important to disaggregate. This is probably the most alarming data for us, is that we then looked at incidence rates by age. And we saw that the incidence trends, that this increase we were seeing was actually especially stark among younger women. So this is showing the rates of breast cancer over the same 21-year period, but now looking specifically at women who were diagnosed at age less than 50. And so what do we see here? So this is now going back, starting off with this Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander group aggregated into one group. So that's the blue line here. And what we see is, again, this recent 5-year period from 2016 to 2021, we see a 3.3% increase per year. All groups are going up. Non-Hispanic whites at 1.6% per year. Also in a more recent time period, non-Hispanic Black population 0.4% per year over the entire 21-year period. Again, I would kind of probably take the rate of increase among the American Indian, Alaska Native group with a little bit of with a grain of salt. I think there's some misclassification there. And then the Hispanic population at 1.6% per year since 2010. But the Asian American Native Hawaiian population, 3.3% each year over just a 5-year period. You could see that we had been seeing an increase, a steady increase since 2000, but that last 5-year period is where we're seeing the jump in the increase. So what do we see? Do we see the same pattern when we disaggregate? Oh, and then I want to point out that in 2021, this rate now among Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander women is almost now as high as non-Hispanic white females, who always historically have had the highest rate. So when we disaggregate, let's now again start out with our first level of disaggregation, which is looking at Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander as one group, and then as Asian American combined as one group. So what we see here is that over this 21-year period, we see a steady increase among the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander group with early onset breast cancer at age less than 50. This is 1.1% per year. And then the black line shows the Asian American combined rates. This is at 3.8% per year since 2017. So this increase that we're seeing is predominantly among Asian Americans. So when we now look at this disaggregated, these 7 specific Asian American ethnic groups, we start to get a sense of which groups are seeing the largest increases. And it's unfortunately, again, this, this sort of other, not otherwise specified Asian group that's seeing the largest increase. And again, hopefully, within a matter of weeks, we'll get the updated data from NCI and be able to kind of adjust this down. But we are seeing that the groups with the largest, fastest increases are the Asian Indian Pakistani group at 2.5% per year. This is steady over the 21-year period, and Vietnamese females at 2.6% per year. This is a more recent increase at 2015 from 2015. The Vietnamese group does have generally a lower rate, but again, you could see that it is going up very rapidly. And then among the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander group, we again were able 2 groups. So the Native Hawaiian and the Guamanian Chamorro and other. And this was confusing to me because this didn't seem to be reflected in the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander aggregated data. So we definitely want to take a little closer look at this, but we did note that in the recent 5-year period, Native Hawaiians did see a dramatic increase of 6.9% per year. I'm not showing you here the confidence interval, which tells us how stable this rate is, but it's not very stable. It's a very, very wide confidence interval. And then again, the Guamanian Chamorro group was kind of a steady 1% per year increase over this 21-year period, just like we saw with the trend for that group for all ages combined. So that's what we're seeing. Just to kind of sum that up, because that was a lot of data I realized I just presented to you. So basically, among Asian American females, we saw breast cancer incidence increase the most rapidly in the last, in recent years, at about 3% per year over the period 2016 to 2021. And the largest increases we're seeing specifically among Korean, Chinese, and Laotian Kampuchean females. Among the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander female population, we saw a much smaller rate of increase, but nonetheless an increase at about 1% per year, and this has been steady. So this isn't a recent increase like we see with Asian Americans, but this has been steady since 2000. And the increase in early onset breast cancer is especially concerning. So what we saw here was for Asian American females, this was an increase of 3.8% per year over the period 2017 to 2021. And the largest increases we're seeing among Asian, Indian, Pakistani, and Vietnamese females. We also saw an increase in early onset breast cancer among the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander female population. But again, this was steady over, not a recent increase like we saw again with Asian Americans, but steady over the past 21-year period, except for this somewhat confusing data that we saw for the Native Hawaiian population, which was a recent increase and at a very high 7% per year. But again, the confidence interval around this percent increase was very wide, suggesting that it's not very stable. And this is the problem. The largest increase was actually seen in this other group, other Asian or Asian not otherwise specified. So we believe this is due to a coding issue in cancer registry data. And as I noted, we're waiting for an improved data set from NCI, which they assured me would be coming in 2 weeks. Some additional observations that I didn't present the data for, but I wanted to share with you is that we actually at these trends by stage. And because the most common question we always get from people is, okay, rates are going up. That's because they're getting screened more. So a way to kind of check that out is to look at incidence trends by stage. And in fact, we saw the same increases across all stages of disease. And we actually saw larger increases for some groups in distant stage disease, so metastatic disease. So this tells us these patterns are not just due to screening more. We also saw some concerning patterns by subtypes of breast cancer. As you know, we know now that breast cancer is not one single homogeneous disease, that there are different subtypes of breast cancer, and each of these subtypes have different etiology and risk factors, and they also have different prognosis and targeted treatment options. So what we saw for some of the Asian American groups was that incidence rates tended to be higher across many of these groups for the HER2/neu subtype. And this was especially concerning for us, was that for many of the groups, we also saw that rates were increasing over time for triple negative breast cancer. So this was what I was mentioning early on. The traditional paradigm for breast cancer incidence patterns with regards to immigration is that risk starts out low in Asia. As you immigrate to the US, your risk goes up. And then with subsequent generations, the risk keeps going up. But 2 recent studies both were done in totally independent studies. Both were set in the San Francisco Bay Area. One of them was my study, another was my colleague at Stanford. Both of these studies independently show that difference, that pattern is reversing, specifically that we saw higher risk of breast cancer among foreign-born Asian American women compared to US-born Asian American women. So this was confusing to us because we felt, what's going on? We adjusted for all the known risk factors and this pattern didn't go away. But then we sort of thought about, oftentimes the Bay Area, because we have such a high cost of living, we're close proximity to Asia. We do, we often are see the first sort of emerging sort of waves of immigration in terms of patterns of types of people who are immigrating. We also know when we look at census data that much more recent cohorts and generations of immigrants tend to be of higher socioeconomic status. So we sort of put those together, higher socioeconomic status among recent immigrants immigrating to the Bay Area, a very high cost of living region, and also just with the tech boom over the past 20 or so years, the people who've been the immigrants, these foreign born, are probably already coming in already at very high risk of breast cancer. And in fact, we know this from international data that breast cancer rates in many of the East Asian countries like Korea, Taiwan, Japan have just been skyrocketing. So, you're comparing those populations who are these foreign-born, the recent immigrants, to those who have, lived here and were born here. And I think that there's a lot worth looking at. It's a very dynamic pattern. Studying these populations further really could potentially tell us a lot that we don't yet know about breast cancer. This increasing incidence, and we see this among younger people, and we see this for some other cancers as well, not just among Asians, but generally across the board. This has been in the press a lot lately. We see this for colorectal cancer, for example. It's thought that this may actually not really be an early onset effect, but in fact, it's maybe a cohort or a generational effect. And specifically that we're seeing an increased risk of these types of cancers among my generation, Generation X. We really don't know why. There's been a lot of hypotheses that have been floating out there, but we just really don't know why. And I think this is another reason why focusing studies and research on these really dynamic populations like Asian Americans can really help us to give us some interesting insights. Here's another trend that is also concerning, whereas we are seeing declining trends in breast cancer mortality rates across all racial and ethnic groups. Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders are the only group that is seeing a stable rate. So it's the most recent trend is that it's a flat mortality rate. So these recent emerging patterns have led to some press, some media that has been highlighting these patterns. And so these were some recent articles that came out last year. And it has motivated us to do a study. So with funding from the Breast Cancer Research Foundation, we launched the CRANE study. And CRANE basically is a study focusing exclusively on breast cancer among Asian American women. It's really part of a larger program that we have going on, including our work in cancer surveillance, looking at cancer registry data to better understand breast cancer risk among Asian American women. CRANE itself is a population-based case control study. We're focusing recruitment in Northern and Southern California, specifically Bay Area and LA County. Participants are asked to fill out a survey and to provide a saliva sample and to provide a hair sample. Saliva allows us to assess germline DNA as well as other potential biological factors, and hair samples allow us to capture sort of environmental exposures, but also levels of cortisol, which can be an indicator of stress embodiment. Our team at UCSF is really, as you heard Joshua in the introduction, really interested in looking at the neighborhood environments. So we are here also, we recognize that cancer and breast cancer in particular too, has a very long latency period. So it's not just what were you exposed to in the past 30 days or past year, it's really what were you exposed to your whole entire life. And sometimes there's research showing that even some exposure is in utero. So we have a lot of expertise in measuring types of attributes of our neighborhood environment. And so with CRANE, we are asking people to report their residential history, which we can use to link in information about the social, built, and physical environments. So we have a lot of data because we actually do know there quite a bit about established risk factors for breast cancer. So unfortunately, the survey is quite long because we have to capture all the known risk factors. And then we're also probing some potential risk factors that we're interested in. And so some of these that are unique to Asian Americans. And so these include experiences with discrimination, the immigration process and experience, as well as different types of stress embodiment, coping, and resiliency. We are actively recruiting. This study has been going on for a couple of years now. We continue to receive, as long as we'll continue to receive funding from the Breast Cancer Research Foundation, we'll keep running the study. Thus far, we've recruited around 400 or so cases and 400 or so controls. So we're in eligibility criteria include being self-identification of any Asian American ethnicity, including those who are multi-race, between ages 21 to 90, live in one of these counties in the Bay Area and in LA. And our current goal for this current funding period is 450 for cases and 450 controls. And among cases, we're looking for fairly recently diagnosed patients, so within the past 18 months. And for controls, they are matched to cases, and also they have to have had no history of any cancers. And again, as I mentioned, participation involves completing a survey, which most people do online, and it is a secure portal. Optionally to provide a saliva sample and a hair sample. And we also ask if they're willing to sign an authorization to access medical records. And among the breast cancer cases, authorization to access their resected tumor tissue so that we can look at breast cancer genomics. And so in terms of compensation for time, cases can receive up to $75 and controls up to $50. And this is our website. So just cranestudy.ucsf.edu. You can also scan the QR code. And yeah, I think if anyone's interested in participating or referring to somebody or just interest in general, definitely connect with us and reach out. And we would love to talk to you. We do a lot of community type of presentations like this. We're always happy to come out and talk to your group. We're also happy to come out and just talk about some, what we know about breast cancer in general. So the second study that I want to share is a new study that we just launched. This is called ASPIRE. This is the first national Asian American cohort study for cancer research. This is co-led by myself, Dr. Ayanna Chang, and Dr. Salma Sharif Marco, and the three of us are all professors in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at UCSF. This is funded through a UO1 grant through the National Cancer Institute. And I've put down here below lots of institutional logos. This is very large. This is a national cohort. And as such, we have collaborators from across these many institutions. So why do we have, and why do we get funded to form an Asian American cohort for cancer? As I noted, as we know here, Asian Americans are very, very diverse. Among the Asian American group, there are more than 30 ethnic populations, and it's the fastest growing population in the US. This population faces unique cancer disparities. So I just showed you some of our latest data on breast cancer. We also, another emerging pattern that we're also researching are high and increasing rates of lung cancer among Asian American females. We have another study that's focused on that. And I think that one of the most important reasons is that there's relatively little research on cancer in Asian Americans. There was a portfolio review of all NIH grants. This review was done in 2021, I believe. And they found 0.17% of all NIH grants were focused on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. There was a similar kind of review that was done a few years prior to that. I think that one was 2017. That one was just for NCI grants, and they found zero grants focused on cancer etiology among Asian Americans. Currently funded cohorts, there are no currently funded cohorts on Asian Americans. There's one cohort that does include oversample of Japanese Americans only, but that's just one group. And the risk factors that they ascertain in that study are not unique to Japanese Americans. So this was an opportunity, a much needed gap for us that we saw, and an opportunity to really form this cohort that we expect, we hope, will sustain over time, because these well-run cohorts go on for years and years and years, certainly beyond our lifetime, and hopefully serve as a useful resource for not only researchers, but communities to better understand risk factors in these unique populations. So as I mentioned, historically, research among Asian Americans has been underfunded. this population is underrepresented in cancer epidemiologic cohorts, and even studies that are, large cohort studies, if they do include Asians, there's not detailed information that are collected about exposures that are unique to the immigration experience. Many smaller Asian American groups are often not included in current cancer research, and unique exposures such as anti-Asian discrimination and immigration-related stress that we do know contributes to many other health risks, but we don't know what their connection to cancer risk is. And then, as I noted, we are seeing emerging disparities such as breast cancer and lung cancer among female never smokers. And because of this vast heterogeneity across the Asian American population, this really gives us a unique opportunity to potentially discover novel cancer risk factors. So this is the team at ASPIRE. For ASPIRE, as I mentioned, this is run by 3 faculty, the 3 of us at UCSF. We have faculty, we have several different sites that are doing recruitment, as well as our biostatistics. We have a community advisory board that I'll show you in a bit. This is run, really kind of put together by, organized under the research group focused on Asians called ARCH at UCSF. And each recruitment site have their local community advisory committee and comprising local community based organizations. And we have a very extensive scientific advisory board who really, if you look at this list, it's really kind of a veritable who's who of Asian American research. And we just feel so incredibly honored to have the opportunity to be advised by this really just amazing group of researchers. And I think for me, this is the most impressive slide, because when we wrote the grant and, we and our partners reached out to just the communities that we already have been working with, the feedback was just a resounding, just enthusiasm and support. And, how can we help? Let us know how we can help. So we said, well, we can, if you want to provide a letter of support, we'd be happy to include it in the grant application. We ended up including 41 letters of support from 41 community organizations. It was just overwhelming. When we got funded, we sent out a notification email to, hey, everybody, great news, we got funded. And just the feedback we got back, and we were actually at a meeting and had an opportunity to see even some of these people in person. It just was, just so, people were like, finally, it's about time. This is our chance, So we really felt that this, we've been waiting for this for so long. This is our moment. And we're certainly doing this not for us, nor our professional careers, but really for the communities. Okay, so I noted that every recruitment site has a local CAB. So I'll just start on the right. This is our local CAB that is helping to guide us on recruitment strategies within the Bay Area. And then we also have a national CAB. We really try to form the CABs with representation from as many groups. It's certainly not representative of all 30 ethnic groups, but we try to be as representative as we can. And many of the national CAB members are also involved in policy. So the aims are, we have 3 methodologic aims and 1 research aim for this UO1. One aim is that we recognize that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach where it comes to engaging, recruiting, and retaining study participants from diverse Asian American communities into research. And in fact, some of us may be really good at reaching 1 or 2 or 3 or even 4 or 5 different Asian American ethnic groups. But many of the smaller groups who have traditionally been left out of these studies, we just really don't know the best ways to engage with them. So the first aim is just to figure out what's the best way to engage with these populations, but really starting from what we already know and having our advisors advise us about, okay, how do we tailor what we know to reach these populations? And then the second aim is a methodologic, really statistical aim that was really aiming to help us to overcome the statistical barrier of small populations. Just because a population is just inherently small in numbers, we usually, from an epidemiological standpoint, end up pulling them all together into one other group, or we leave them out of the analysis. And that's surely due to the fact that we don't have good statistical tools to do otherwise. So we're trying to develop better statistical tools. We are also really interested in developing statistical tools that will allow us to look at how different social identities intersect together. And so we're leveraging machine learning approaches in combination with community feedback for assessing interactions across multiple social factors and social identities. And then finally, from a research aim, we're interested in looking at different pathways by which multi-level factors ranging from structural factors to experiences with discrimination, for example, how these may ultimately impact cancer risk. And so these pathways that we're interested in looking at are healthcare access, including multiple dimensions of healthcare access and cancer screening, cancer relevant health behaviors, and self-reported stress. So in this first phase of funding, this is the grant we received from NCI. With the funding that was available to us, we're able to aim to recruit 20,000 Asian Americans, males and females. The age range is a bit older. We would like to expand it to be inclusive of younger ages if we can get additional funding. So right now we're including ages 40 to 75. We are aiming for this to be population-based, meaning that we want to be as representative of the underlying population as we possibly can. We also want to oversample understudied groups. Excuse me, including Bangladeshi, Cambodian, Hmong, Thai, and Pakistani, but this will necessarily require us to undersample the largest group, which is Chinese. We're trying to include as many languages as we can so we can be inclusive and not exclude potential participants on the basis of language. So this is the list of languages that we're starting with, but we know it's still not all inclusive, but this is a start. And in order to get to being representative and population-based, and we're relying on multiple modes of recruitment. This is a national recruitment, but we recognize that just by putting an ad out on Facebook or Instagram, that's not going to result in a representative sample, right? So we really need to work with communities and community organizations. And again, this UO1 funding, although it is very welcome and much needed funding to start to build this cohort, it's really just enough for us to get started. So it's for an initial cohort build. We want to apply for more funding, and we have future plans to expand I wrote here 50,000, but we really need to get to 100,000 Asian Americans to be powered to look at cancer risk. And ultimately, in terms of the impact, we hope that ASPIRE is an opportunity and is a resource for everybody, all of us, to inform strategic cancer prevention and intervention strategies that are relevant for Asian American populations. And this means informing policy, informing clinical and public health practice, serving as a resource for communities for interventions at both the community and individual level. We want to make the data available to researchers and to trainees, and we hope again that it becomes a research resource for many, many generations to come. This is our website, aspirecohort.ucsf.edu. We are just waiting for our final IRB approval to come in. We hope it's going to come in any day now. Then we're like ready to launch recruitment. QR code also takes you to the same website. And I know one question that had been asked, which I can answer here right away, is whether there are opportunities for student volunteers. And yes, so we are launching an ambassador program for the ASPIRE cohort. If you go to the website, you could see information on the ambassador program. And this was our press release from UCSF that talks about the study. This actually came out when we first got funding, which was last summer. And that was all that I had. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Gomez. So now we'll transition to the Q&A, and I'm going to start with some like broad questions and then go into some like study-specific logistic questions. So first of all, what are some hypotheses for increased breast cancer incidence among Asian American women?
Yeah, that's a great question. Uh, the studies in Asia suggested that it's some of it is due to the established risk factors. Um, Asia is sort of a really interesting natural experiment because what has happened in some of these East Asian countries over the past 30 or so years is that many of the traditional ways of living, I grew up in Taiwan and I remember I would go to the market, our local market, farmer's market, and buy all the fresh fruits and vegetables and, buy the fish that was just caught that morning and maybe like one slab of meat that would last us for several days. And so everything was fresh, everything was multi-courses, and it was all prepared fresh that day. But we were able to do that because, my grandmother or my mother, whomever, my aunt, weren't working. They were stay at home. Or we had housekeepers. And so there was an interesting sort of article I had read about this sort of pattern of women in Japan. This was specifically focused on Japan, where they were, showing data on how more and more women were entering the workforce, establishing professional careers. Um, and that was really great. But it was at a cost of many of them taking on more these reproductive factors that we do know are associated with increased breast cancer risk. And so that means using hormones, delaying childbearing, having fewer children, and not being able to breastfeed. So those are the really well-established reproductive risk factors for breast cancer that unfortunately, as a result of this, industrialization was happening in some of these Asian countries. So that's the belief, but we also feel that when we looked at our data, that study that I mentioned comparing US born to foreign born, even after we adjusted for those risk factors, we still saw higher risk. So there's something else. There's additional things going on. And as much as we do know about breast cancer, there's also a lot we don't know. And a lot of those risk factors that have been identified are really, we now realize are for the most common subtypes of breast cancer, lumino B and potentially lumino A. But we're seeing different predominance of different subtypes of breast cancer for Asian American women. And those are the rarer subtypes that we know less about in terms of the risk factors. So the answer is we don't know, and we hope to find that out with these two studies.
Great, thank you. And the second question is, you mentioned a couple of risk factors. Are there any specific research done correlating birth control pills or endometriosis and breast cancer?
Mm. Yes, I do believe that birth control pills, and so that does be to the extent that it does involve consumption of intake of estrogen, that has been shown to be associated with an increased risk of breast cancer. I don't know about the newer formulations of birth control pills and the different forms of ingestion. So I'm not familiar with that literature. I don't believe endometriosis has been established to be related to breast cancer, but again, I'm also not, just because I haven't seen it in the literature doesn't mean that it may be literature that I may have missed.
Mhm. And can you speak to different foods that might contribute to risk of breast cancer in Asian Americans? And specifically, like, is there any risk tied to soy-based food and drinks?
Yeah. Yeah. So soy is really interesting because it is it does have a similar formulation in terms of its chemical form as estrogen. So there is a common misperception that that soy is estrogenic, but in fact it's counter estrogenic because it has a similar chemical constituent. It actually blocks the actions of estrogen. Um, but probably maybe the only food that has been shown to be potentially associated with breast cancer, but that's really only for postmenopausal breast cancer, is dietary fat. Um, but that's not, I don't believe that's been associated with premenopausal breast cancer. So that's with the big asterisk. I think that diet is very difficult to measure using an epidemiological study. So just because no sort of particular dietary components have really come out of many of these studies doesn't mean that one doesn't exist. It could just mean we don't have a good way of measuring them yet. And I personally think that soy is, most of the studies that have looked at soy are in Western populations, for which soy intake is much lower than that in Eastern populations. In prostate cancer, for example, when we look, there's been a small handful of studies looking at soy and prostate cancer risk in Asia. And those generally actually show a protective effect of soy on prostate cancer risk. But that's only in these Asian studies. And so that is only when at a very high level of soy intake. So I do think that there's value to doing some of these studies because we again have this heterogeneity in exposures, and soy is a great example of maybe it's not so much that there's no association, it's just we haven't reached the level needed to have a protective effect.
Right. Very fascinating. Thank you for sharing
Yeah.
that. Um, Given the rising rates of breast cancer incidence among Asian American women under 50, um, I've kind of a two-part question for you. So the first is, what do you think of recommending Asian American women to
Yeah.
begin screening earlier? And then the
Yeah.
second part question is, what strategies can effectively increase awareness and screening in
Yeah.
this community?
Yeah. Um, so I think I'll answer the second part question because we do know that screening rates are very low among Asian Americans in general. It's lower in some ethnic groups of Asian Americans than others, but even collectively as a group, we have among the lowest rates of breast cancer screening, and we've not, over many years, have not caught up to the Healthy People guidelines. So there's still already a lot of work to do there. We know screening works, screening is effective, and it does help to catch. It doesn't prevent breast cancer, but it does help to catch it at an earlier stage. So I definitely think we should be promoting screening. There's been a lot of really good studies done of the best ways to promote screening. I think this is again where a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't necessarily work. So what strategies that promote screening in one group maybe need to be slightly tailored for another group. But I think we know enough. I think we know enough about really how to really, work with uh, to promote screening. The younger women, that's a trickier question. And one thing I actually totally neglected to mention is mammographic density. We do know Asian American women, especially younger Asian American women, are more likely to have denser breasts. Denser breasts have sort of two things going for them. One, it makes breast cancers harder to detect on mammograms. And two, it itself is a risk factor for breast cancer. Um, I think that, certainly being aware of your breast mammographic density and just having that knowledge is important from an self-advocacy standpoint. I think that, I myself have family history of breast cancer. I'm a patient with I won't say which, but it's a health maintenance organization. And I was not able to get screening at an earlier age than what the USPSTF guidelines recommended, because this is just what what the health HMO recommendations are. So one of our scientific advisors is my hero and is the reason why I'm doing this research. Her name is Susan Shinagawa. She's a three-time breast cancer survivor. And her story is that when she was in her 40s, she herself felt a lump. She tried to get a biopsy. She went to three different doctors before somebody would finally do a biopsy for her. And the responses that she was receiving at the time was, well, you're too young to have breast cancer and you're Asian. Asian women don't get breast cancer. And so she's told her story, and that quote just has resonated with me. And now she's a great friend. And she was one of the ones that was in tears when she heard that our study was funded. And she said that the reason that that opinion is out there among clinicians is because of the data we present. So you almost can't kind of blame them. I think you need to blame us, those of us who produce the data and the statistics. And this is why we're trying to do the best that we can to present disaggregated statistics. And so I think there is a lot of self-advocacy that has to go into it, unfortunately. I think being aware of your family history is very important. Being aware of your breast density is important. And, as much as you can, knowing what their established risk factors are, but also recognizing that just because you do everything right doesn't mean that, that's not going to predetermine your risk entirely.
Mhm. And going off of the idea that breast density is a risk factor for breast cancer, are there any distinctive differences in breast density among Asian women subgroups?
Mhm. Not to my knowledge. I don't know that there has been enough research to get at that detail. And again, I haven't totally dived completely into that literature, so I may be speaking off point here, but not to my knowledge.
Mhm. Okay.
Yeah.
And a couple of questions, just rapid fire on,
Okay.
like I think some
Ready.
participants might be interested in joining these studies.
Yeah.
So for folks who have a breast implant, can they still take part in the breast cancer research?
Yes.
Okay. And is Aspire actively recruiting in Texas and the southern US?
Yes. We are national. So all US and US territories.
Okay. And what are specific, like cancer specific health behaviors that you'll study in the Aspire study?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question. So some established behaviors like physical activity, we do have some dietary questions, although many of our diet questions are trying to capture more acculturation, dietary acculturation, and physical activity, smoking, alcohol consumption, vaccinations, we're also interested in some emerging risk factors. So cooking oil fumes and cooking practices, some occupational exposures from, pollutants, chemical pollutants, neighborhood level factors. We're really interested in pollution. We're really, really interested in some of the effects of climate change, like wildfires, extreme heat, some other emerging, more personal level risk factors like screen time, sitting time, and we're very interested in experienced stress. Stress is a big focus, and so we have a lot of survey questions measuring different types of stress that people may have experienced over their lifetime, as well as how they coped with that stress and questions around like resiliency.
Mm. And one participant also asked if there are plans to assess repeated dietary intake among participants in the study.
Yeah, that's a great question. We unfortunately, and we were like, oh we can't. We don't want to tax our participants by like asking them a ton of questions. So the dietary questions that we do include are pretty broad and fairly selected. What we would love to do is to get additional funding and do a much more have a in-depth dietary assessment, including repeated measures. So the way that our survey methodology is going to work for Aspire is that rather than sort of, again, we're trying to make the burden as little as possible for participants, but rather than having, typically you participate in these studies like the Crane study, um, we ask them to complete like one very long survey in one sitting. Aspire, we've split it up into 4 surveys that can be done over the course of a year. So you'll, sort of get a break in between surveys. And so each survey will be hopefully a bit shorter than like one giant long survey. But because it's spread out over the year, we do have an opportunity to kind of assess some changes over the course of a year.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gomez. That was a wonderful lecture. And for everyone who attended today, I really appreciate your time. Thank you all for coming today. And in case you have any questions that we didn't get to, please email stanfordcare@stanford.edu, and we will send your questions to Dr. Gomez. So have a wonderful night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much.